Well, the war in Ukraine is entering its fourth year, and the events of the past 24 hours is a stark reminder of the difficulties faced not only by those on the front lines, but also those who are living through this deadly conflict, as well as the country's leaders. Journalist Emmanuelle Chaze has been covering the war across Ukraine, and she joins me now from Kyiv. Emmanuelle, thank you so much for your time today. Now, you've been living in Kyiv for quite some time. You've traveled across the country. What's the mood there like, especially after some of the biggest Russian strikes across Ukraine since the invasion began?
Well, it's quite striking to see that, for example, here in Kyiv, we can lead a relatively normal life most of the time, but then there will be such attacks that are daily attacks against Ukraine. It mostly happens at night, and you mentioned these drone attacks. 267 drones were launched by Russia all over Ukraine, and every night here in Kyiv, I can tell you that when I'm at home, you hear the air red alert, you hear the sirens, and then you hear the sound of drones coming over the city and being shot down by air defense. So you hear, that air defense, you hear explosions, you sometimes see drones falling, and when they fall, even when they are intercepted, which is mostly the case, well, they damage buildings, and unfortunately, they also claim victims. People are being injured, people are being killed by those drones. Out of those 267 drones, most of them have been either intercepted or rerouted, and there's only 6 of them that hit the targets. But for Ukrainians, that's 6 too many because damage has been caused and people have been injured.
And are you observing as well as these attacks happen and the intensity of these attacks do increase, as we saw over the past couple of days? Is it forcing more Ukrainians to be heading across the border elsewhere?
Well, people who chose to remain here have already seen so much. If they decided to stay here in 2022, they're not going to leave right now. The question is more that the millions of people who left in 22, half of them are said never to come back, and that will create a demographic problem here in Ukraine, on top of the problem that we have with internally displaced people who might never see their homes again, and of course, the tens of thousands of people who have gone missing, who live under Russian occupation, people who have been killed on the front line. So it's a country that is being destroyed relentlessly by its aggressor, Russia.
Yes, and as this is happening, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, he's hosting a meeting of world leaders. We saw him welcome, the heads of state of quite a number of countries, including Canada, Sweden, and Finland. What's happening at this meeting, and what's likely to be an outcome?
Well, since the U-turn of Washington's policy towards Kyiv and its alignment towards Moscow's narrative when it comes to Ukraine, especially EU leaders have been left facing their hour of truth, if you will, because if Ukraine falls, if Ukraine loses this war, well, nothing prevents Russia then to attack other countries, namely the Baltic countries, namely Poland as well, with which it shares a border. So Eastern European countries are very much aware of that danger, also because they've already lived Russian invasions in the past. And so we see EU leaders here today, along with Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, along also with Ursula von der Leyen. There's also Pedro Sanchez coming from Spain. They came here not only to reiterate their support, but also to see what security guarantees for Ukraine they can come up with together, because this is really a moment for Europe to face its defense policy and to increase it if it wants to have an efficient defense against any aggression that might come from Russia in the future.
And what's the reaction in Ukraine of what Volodymyr Zelenskyy has had to say over the past 24 hours, saying that he would resign if it meant that Ukraine could join NATO and achieve peace?
Well, first off, Ukraine knows that it cannot join NATO unless there is a peace. And we are very far off any peace that would be fair for Ukraine. So I don't think we're going to see Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon. And also, when he first ran for presidency and won his campaign, Volodymyr Zelenskyy in 2019 had said he would not run for a second term. Now, we cannot have elections right now in Ukraine because we are under martial law, and it is against the constitution to have elections during under martial law. Why? Because you have millions of Ukrainians who live abroad, you have millions of people who are internally displaced, and you have hundreds of thousands of people who are on the front line. So how could those people vote in an orderly manner? And how could candidates even run for presidency fairly in such circumstances? So as soon as there will be peace here, there will also be elections. And Volodymyr Zelensky had said anyway that he would only be president for one term, and it has already been a prolonged term because of the war. So I don't think those, those declarations mean as much here in Ukraine as it does in the West, hearing that he might resign should Ukraine join NATO.
Yes, and Emmanuelle, I mean, you've been reporting on this conflict for quite some time. From your personal experience, how have things change in recent times, and also in terms of how you have been covering the war?
Well, the more you stay in a country, the more personal the war becomes, because, more and more people who are involved at any level, humanitarian, on the front line. And someone was telling me earlier, and it's not the first time I've heard that they are, for example, their mobile phone is turning into a graveyard of names. And I think this is quite accurate. When you live here, you lose more and more people. You always go to funerals. You always know someone who has lost a loved one. So it becomes different. Also, the way of reporting, I hope my way of reporting is still objective and I still report fairly. But you also see that there's a disinterest most of the time abroad from what is happening, because people just get used to it. And here it's very much a reality, an everyday reality. People keep on dying on the front line. People keep on being bombed every day, and it hasn't changed. What has changed, though, is the rhetoric. Now, when we see Washington adopting the Kremlin's rhetoric, this is highly damageable for Ukraine because it's no longer, for many in the West, we no longer talk about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, but Ukraine not wanting to sign a deal with Trump, for example. But we are still in a war of aggression that has been waged unilaterally by Russia against Ukraine.
Well, Emmanuelle Chaze, we always appreciate the great work that you're doing and giving us the time to speak with us. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.